Welcome to this edition of Racing News. We focus our attention this week on Hong Kong and their interest in our bloodstock market. Could a new diagnostic test for African horse sickness, which was recently recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health, along with positive steps made by the protocol's task team led by Adrian Todd, be opportune? All this comes at a time when the Australian authorities have clamped down on the repatriation of their horses from Hong Kong. So what could all this mean for South Africa? More after the break. The South African connection with Hong Kong goes back a long way. One only has to look at the dominance of the Hong Kong Jockey Premiership, which existed for over 20 years, with the likes of champions Basil Marcus, Douglas White and Robbie Fradd. Trainers Tony Millard and David Ferraris have made names for themselves amongst the trainers' ranks, and horses like London News, JJ the Jet Plane, Variety Club and more recently Singapore Sling have flown the South African flag. Over the years, Hong Kong would have attracted more of our horses if it weren't for the fact that our racing and breeding industries have effectively been locked in a straitjacket by restrictive export quarantine regulations. Although the sample size for measuring the success of South African bred horses in Hong Kong has been very small, those which have raced have held their own, particularly against the prominent number of Australian imports. As many as 40 to 50% of the horses competing in Hong Kong are Australian bred. Somewhat and rather uniquely, the Hong Kong Jockey Club requires all horses on completion of their racing careers to be exported or repatriated to make way for new and incoming horses. We came to the offices of Racing South Africa and CEO Peter Gibson to ask more.
Hong Kong importers are obliged to put down a deposit, which then contributes to the costs of repatriating those horses that are sound enough to travel back to the country of origin.
And herein lies the rub. In a somewhat controversial decision in October last year, the Australian Department of Agriculture and Water Resources altered its quarantine status regarding Hong Kong. All returning horses are now required to spend 180 days or 6 months in a third country such as New Zealand before re-entering Australia.
That is the problem, that suddenly the budget for a return of a horse has gone out the window. And I have to say, Hong Kong is now experiencing what South Africa has experienced for so many years. Impossible conditions of export.
Owners are not only responsible to foot the bill, but if there are delays in finding alternative retirement properties for outgoing horses and they continue to occupy limited space, it will cause a backlog of incoming horses which are needed to sustain racing. So what has led to the Australian authorities reviewing their policy? It's got to do with the incorporation of the Chongfa Training Centre on mainland China. In 2009, the Hong Kong Jockey Club constructed a purpose-built equestrian centre to host the 2010 Asian Games. It was located across the border in China in the district known as Chongfa. The area was established as a disease-free zone and recognized as such by the EU Commission. Pre- and post-quarantine requirements were put in place, with the horses from the 16 different participating countries also having to travel along a corridor to Chongfa from Hong Kong and back along the same corridor to exit from Hong Kong on their way out. Shortly after the games were completed, the Hong Kong Jockey Club commenced the reconstruction of the facility into a training centre to not only expand their operation but also their horse population. Completion of the centre is expected later in 2018, and in preparation, the Hong Kong Jockey Club has increased the number of import permits issued from 330 in 2017 to 440 for this current season. However, in October 2017, the Australian government's Department of Agriculture and Water Resources announced that it would be altering its quarantine status regarding Hong Kong as a result of the CTC becoming part of the general Hong Kong bioenvironment.
what's happened since the development of Chongfa, the Australian import or quarantine authorities have viewed that movement between Hong Kong and China effectively as having posed an additional risk to their security, and therefore have suspended direct imports of horses from Hong Kong back to Australia, in which case these horses now have to travel either via New Zealand or via the UK.
Adding a 6-month quarantine in New Zealand and additional air transport to owners' bills will now make repatriation to Australia expensive. It may well be that prospective owners choose to buy somewhere else cheaper, like South Africa, knowing repatriation is a straightforward single flight home. Interestingly, Australia stands alone, as on the 13th of February, the EU adopted a decision whereby they and their 28 member countries will treat all horses in the equine disease-free area of Chongfa as having the same health status as those in Hong Kong. In other words, as of last month, those horses based in Chongfa will be deemed by the EU as having the same freedom of movement as those based in Hong Kong, but not according to the Australian authorities. So as one international scribe put it, in the grand traditions of unintended consequences, the Australian quarantine authorities might play a role in eroding the Australian thoroughbred industry's strong grip on Hong Kong. All this comes amidst new developments in African horse sickness testing. In June 2017, the World Organization for Animal Health approved a South African-developed diagnostic test for African horse sickness. We came to Baker McVeigh in Summerveld to speak to John McVeigh himself to find out more.
Well, the new what's called PCR test, which is like a fingerprint, instead of trying to have a look at the whole virus, you literally find the fingerprint that the virus was there and you find its DNA. Yes. That's basically what a PCR is. It's quite simple and it's extremely sensitive. And Professor Guthrie's produced what is the gold standard PCR. There is another PCR which has been accepted by the World Organization for Animal Health, which is OIE, it's French, don't try the acronym. But it will enable us to have shorter quarantine times, given the fact that we're able to pinpoint the virological status of a horse. Does it have African horse sickness or not? Is it active? Is it there? And it's sensitive, it will pick that up. So down the line, we'll be able to have more pragmatic quarantine periods. Yes. And that's the aim of it, where we can determine there and then and quite rapidly and accurately the exact status of that horse. And prior to being shipped, test it, it's free, off it goes.
From an importer's perspective, all they want to know, is that horse infectious, yes or no? And the real-time PCR, apart from being able to be done in a very short time frame, will tell you whether there's virus in that horse. And it's a very clear answer. It really is now the new gold standard for diagnostic testing. So whereas before, in the OIE code, they wanted a 40-day period in order to satisfy their concerns about incubation. And of course, coupled with the serology test, which took 7 plus 21 days, that's 28 days, and then a little bit of extra time for practical purposes, the real-time PCR will be able to reduce that time frame down to as little as 14 days, which is the understood incubation period for African horse sickness. So if you look at our current quarantine or protocol with the EU, 20 days in the free zone, followed by 40 days under vector protection in the quarantine station, total of 60 days. In the future, subject to the willingness of importing countries to adopt what's in the OIE code, they could reduce that quarantine period down to 14 days. On a practical level, it probably will be around about 21 days in order to manage the horses. And there are other diseases, of course. But that's the most important part, reducing quarantine timeframes.
It is true that South Africa has been short of influential people in high places since the EU removed it from the list of permissible direct export countries back in 2004. The failure of being able to coordinate thoroughbred industry developments with national government action hampered progress in finding solutions. However, following a failed audit by the EU in 2013, there's been a positive move to reorganize efforts. We spoke to Adrian Todd from the South African Equine Health and Protocols NPC.
After the workshop that was put together by the overall industry in 2015, the outcome of that was the task team.
Yes.
And that's all-encompassing. It's chaired by Chris van Niekerk. And there's representatives from throughout industry there. As we got more and more into it, we started to have a few successes. And we realized it needed full-time focus, and that's when I was asked to apply myself to this full-time. And we obviously needed an entity that was a bit firmer than a task team. A committee is a fairly loose sort of an arrangement.
Yes.
So that led to the establishment of SA Equine Health and Protocols, and it's essentially the implementation arm of the task team. And the focus there is to pull all the efforts together that are involved in the protocols drive. And that's what we've successfully done, having one united voice and everything housed under the one umbrella.
Adrian, what's the aim of the SA Equine Health and Protocols task team?
Well, apart from the industry now being totally united under the banner, I have to say that I think without a doubt our biggest achievement to date is the public-private partnership that we formed with our own government.
Yes.
At the end of the day, protocols are between governments. And you know, right from the beginning, Mike de Kock, who's very involved in this and one of our founding directors, had always said, it's at the end of the day a government-to-government thing.
Yes.
And industry can talk to industry as much as we like. But it's that partnership that we've managed to form with government that is so vital. I mean, it's reached a stage where the International Movement of Horses Committee meetings in Hong Kong in December, for the first time we were accompanied by our government. We had Dr. Marcher, the head of animal health.
Right.
So that just changes the whole thing. Then when you're having a discussion with the Hong Kong government, for instance, it's now an official discussion as opposed to just a chat.
Adrian, there's an official EU Commission coming to South Africa in 2018. What is the purpose of their mission?
Well, it'll be an audit. What we're hoping to do is to achieve the audit this year. In 2013, South Africa failed its EU audit.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that we do have an existing protocol with the EU.
Yes.
We're just under the ban at the moment because there had been some cases of AHS within the control zones.
Yes.
Now, the 2 years will be up this year, and then we get an EU audit. And that's been our number one priority. We've been working very hard. We've been bringing in international experts to give us a critical pre-audit. And that's of all our systems, our infrastructure, our quarantines, everything.
Yes.
And we believe that we're well on the way to being able to pass an audit. A successful audit would put us straight back on track to be able to export direct to the EU under the original protocol. We're very busy actually in starting negotiations with other countries for direct exports as well.
The production of horses in South Africa costs a fraction of the price compared to Europe, Australia and the US. In fact, less than half, which makes South Africa a very attractive market. If it becomes possible for Hong Kong to import directly from South Africa, in the same way as it is with horses from Australia or New Zealand, but at a lesser price, South African horses will become very popular very quickly. The biggest indication that change could be on the way came with the arrival of the Hong Kong Jockey Club's team of international buyers at the CTS Premier Yearling Sale in January. Vian, is this the first time that the Hong Kong Jockey Club have sent an international delegation of buyers to represent them at the Cape Premier Yearling Sale?
Yes, Michelle, it was, and certainly very exciting for us. And they were represented by Nick Collum and Mark Richards. They bought 4 yearlings and spent just over 6 million rand. The reason why Hong Kong Jockey Club go around the world buying these yearlings is all these horses are destined for their own ready to run sale,
Yes.
which they only hold when these horses are 3 years old. So there's still quite a journey ahead for these horses, only being sold in March 2020.
Are these horses all to go through the standard protocol arrangements in South Africa as they currently stand?
These horses are already in quarantine. They're in quarantine in Cape Town, and then the journey via Mauritius starts from here. So from Cape Town, they fly to Mauritius. They're then in quarantine in Mauritius for 90 days, and from there they go to England. And I believe the horses will be prepared in England for later export to Hong Kong for the actual sales in 2020.
The cost of quarantine and freighting unfortunately adds considerably to the costs of purchase.
That was one of the complaints of the Hong Kong buying team, that it's going to cost them $60,000-$70,000. They're buying the horse for $60,000-$70,000. Now it's costing them the same to ship it. So from a commercial perspective, it's imperative that from South African point of view, that we're able to shorten the quarantine period, ship the horses to Cape Town, and get them out a bit quicker. When that happens is up to the various organisations and Adrian and his team to push for pragmatic protocols. The science helps us get more pragmatic protocols, but I fear that will be a little bit down the line, not immediate.
Have they bought horses in South Africa in the hope that our export protocols will be lifted and that we will be able to export directly to Hong Kong in the future?
Absolutely, Michelle, and I think that's the hope for all of us, and for Hong Kong to have come and invested heavily into the South African market as they have, despite the significant travel restrictions and the rather arduous journey ahead for these horses. For me, that must be a very positive sign for the future, and must be a sign that they believe that there will be moves on export protocols in the coming months and years.
Hong Kong's interest in South Africa goes further too, with their jockey club having already added a South African simulcast to its list this season, with the possibility of more to come. Time will tell. At a time when positive steps have been made towards the integration of our horses globally, it's opportune that South African-bred Singapore Sling won the $10 million Hong Kong Classic Cup for trainer Tony Millard. The smart son of philanthropist Singapore Sling couldn't have timed it better with his win, so much so that he's been heralded as the new poster child for South African-bred imports by the international press.
Singapore Sling, he wants vengeance for defeat in the Classic Mile. Race to a narrow lead from the Golden Age. Then Exultant, nothing I like more, can't win, but Singapore Sling careering away with the Classic Cup. Singapore Sling.
Tony Millard has been a campaigner of South African-bred horses in his adopted homeland of Hong Kong. He's consistently believed them to be equal to the best raced in Hong Kong. The difficulties with African horse sickness and the long process for export have been reasons there have been so few South African horses in Hong Kong. The reality is that owners don't want to buy horses and then wait at least a year while they literally tour the world before they get to see them run. Michael Cox in the South China Morning Post on the 18th of February 2018 wrote, "Currently horses exported from South Africa to Hong Kong have to take a trip that makes Phineas Fogg's adventures look like a trip to the local 7-Eleven. This well-known Jules Verne character made it around the world in 80 days, but in a considerably quicker time frame than any of our thoroughbreds. It hardly appeals to the instant gratification culture of Hong Kong racing." The Hong Kong Jockey Club are not only looking at South Africa as a possible new market, but others, including the Argentine. John McVeigh tells us of his recent trip.
They are looking to source horses from new areas. They've got quite a lot of empty berths, as it were. They're looking to extend where they procure horses. They've come to South Africa, we're all aware of that, CTS, and they were looking to go to different shows. They've never bought in the Argentines before. I'd been there before with Mike de Kock, Jean Mulherba and a few other gentlemen of South African turf. So I knew the lie of the land, and they asked me if I could help with regards to that. And naturally I was there to vet horses, not to to source them.
The Argentine have also faced challenges exporting their horses, but for reasons different to our own.
They've had established protocols in place. You can have a horse racing in Buenos Aires, and 7 days later it can be in New York. So their life's a lot easier than ours is in South Africa. They can export horses all over the world. They don't have the quarantine issues that we have in South Africa. So even though they haven't been exporting for the last 10 years, that was political. Their last presidents were slightly more complicated than ours. They are now in a position where they can export again. I won't get into details, but they can export again and export reasonably and fairly. And they've also got some very competitively priced horses.
We asked Peter if the markets were to open up, what the implications would be for South Africa.
Obviously, growth in exports, which means foreign investment. So everybody wins. So country is getting foreign revenue in. Horse owners, breeders are having more confidence to invest. That means new blood. The potential of shuttle stallions, of course, exists with a reasonable importation, exportation platform. And of course, just the greater participation, I think, in racing from a local perspective. That people who then will buy a yearling, they get lucky, wins its second start easily, it's get a rating of 86, suddenly it's eligible to enter Hong Kong on a private purchase permit. That means that instead of the 200,000 Rand that you paid for it, potentially you're going to get 200,000 US dollars. So there's a speculative component to it as well. But really it's investment into our market, which I think will then stimulate more interest in racing, which, as we all know, has been much lower than it should have been compared, especially if you look at South Africa with Australia, who's got incredible levels of participation at every level. So, I mean, that's the stimulus that I think we're all waiting for.
Singapore Sling stepped beautifully.
South African breeders are well known for producing progressive maturing stock, and the comparative few which have undertaken the arduous outward journey have attracted international attention. If we, together with government, can work together towards reassessing our export protocols and reducing quarantine times, it could be fair to say that the world awaits. That's it for this week's edition of Racing News. We'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time on Sunday, the 18th of March, for another bumper show. The Racing News Show and previous screenings are available online at www.goldcircle.co.za. Click on the YouTube icon, go to playlists, and click on Racing News to access all shows to date. Stop, Ellen.